That is basically God. He has a purpose in our lives. I mean, our lives are used for his greater purpose. And that's something that we can't see. We can't see the full picture. But what it does give us is hope that there is always hope to be found, even in the darkest of places. And sometimes it does involve us like actively looking out for those silver linings or blessings in our lives. Because it does take effort. Because I know that the world, it can be a very negative place if we allow it. And that's when we really just need to kind of lean in, on kind of God's greater understanding that we can't, because we can't see it, but our lives are being used for a greater purpose.
Do you ever wonder where God is at when life is flipped upside down? I'm Sherry, your host, and I created this podcast so that my guests and I could look at the good God we profess through the lens of pain and suffering. What I have learned both firsthand and through the personal stories of my guests is that the God of the Holy Bible speaks beautiful things in the dark. God invites us to give him our pain because he's the only one who can transform the very thing that was meant to destroy us. Our challenge is to trust him in the process so that we might come to understand who he really is versus who we think he should be. Listen in and discover the countless ways in which we can find God in our pain. My guest is Denise Clanin, a wife, a mom, an author. She and I connected because of her willingness to share her personal story about losing her brother Garrett to a rare mutation known as NF2. This disorder caused tumors to grow throughout his body, and that resulted in degrees of losing his quality of life, such as his ability to speak and hear, two of the major ways we communicate with each other. That's critical. I can't even fathom that slow separation from your loved ones. At the time of the diagnosis, Denise was 9 and Garrett 11. At the time of Garrett's passing, he was 29. My conversation with Denise weaved together loss and resilience and faith, and the fact that grief can be very transformative in powerful ways. Faith was the cornerstone for Denise as she navigated what it meant to have a sibling who was experiencing a gradual decline in health and in quality of life. We talked about how she felt as her parents naturally gravitated to Garrett's ever-increasing dependency. And I was curious about that because at 9 years old, that's elementary school and then middle school, high school, college, crucial years for a young girl, a young woman. And as we talked, in her voice and the way she shared about this part of the journey, I heard healing and acceptance saturated with grace. With the ever-morphing process of the family dynamic, we talked about identity and how that is impacted and how everything about our life is based on our identity. So what do we do when things are shifted and we lose titles or responsibilities or relationships? Denise talked about God's ability to use the tragedy of life for transformation in us and how he moves us into a greater purpose using the pain of life. We talked about the book she authored, Among the Stars, and how she blended parts of her life to create a family-friendly read that has an uplifting message for the heart and the mind. We folded into the conversation how therapeutic writing and journaling can be in the grief process. And she started on her next book that will develop one of the characters found in the first book. So I love a series where you can engage in more than one book. Let's listen in, and I hope you'll be encouraged by Denise's desire to share her experience into the complexities of grief, the importance of community, and the enduring power of hope, faith, and love. Denise, thank you for taking the time to have this conversation. I know grief is not something someone likes talking about, so I appreciate your heart behind the purpose of this conversation because I genuinely believe that vulnerability about grief is what encourages others to find their own personal healing. So again, thank you and welcome to the show today.
Thank you for having me on here.
The pain point that we're discussing today, as it pertains to you personally, is the loss of your brother. So tell us a little bit about your brother. Was he older, younger? What was the age difference? And did he have any annoying brotherly habits?
Well, he was 2 years older than I was. And his name was Garrett, and we were very close growing up. Our family, our parents and I, we went on family vacations together. We were very close, had a lot of close family friends where we had dinners together. And so I had just generally very positive memories with my brother. He would definitely have his quirks. He was very into music, especially rock music. And I do remember some fun experiences when I was younger when he would be blasting his music very loudly in his bedroom, and I could hear it because I was in the bedroom next to him. That was definitely a soundtrack to my childhood and adolescence. So, but in general, we were very close, and he was a very positive, uplifting person. And he had a very contagious sense of humor. Anyone around him would just instantly laugh, and you just feel good about yourself because he was very kind to anyone he encountered.
That sounds like a blessing to a lot of people. And you know what I found out recently? I love wit and humor. My husband and I had that in common. But I found out that humor is a sign of intelligence. And as a sister, you might not have seen that in your brother, because I wouldn't have said that about my brother, but yet he has a photographic memory. I learned that about him later. So I find that very intelligent. But so thinking about your brother's wit and his humor, did you find him to be an intelligent person?
He had definitely had skills academically. He helped me a lot with like math, especially. He's very good at math and numbers. He could actually calculate large sums or multiplication in his head. He was like almost like a walking calculator. So
Yeah.
very intelligent. Definitely would say that.
Talk to us about your brother's diagnosis. What age was he when he received that diagnosis?
So he was 11 years old when he was diagnosed with NF2, which is a disorder that causes tumors to grow throughout his body. And that usually results in deafness and other loss of abilities. For him, it was more, he did lose his hearing, and he also did lose his ability to speak and to had impaired vision. That happened later in his 20s when he lost those abilities. And currently, there is no cure. Some cases are less severe than others. His ended up being more on the severe end, and there's still a lot to learn about this disorder because it is, I think it's 1 in 40,000 people.
Oh, okay.
It's still relatively rare. He was born with it, but he wasn't diagnosed until later just because he hadn't noticed any loss of abilities until 11 years old when he had a hearing test where his hearing started to decrease.
When you received the diagnosis as a family, is that something that impacted you then? Because it sounds like you were young at that time when he got the diagnosis.
I was 9 years old. And so at that time, I didn't really fully understand what that meant, how long like we had with my brother. My parents obviously were sharing little bits about it with me. They weren't giving me the whole picture because I was too young to really understand. But I did know something was serious because they did test me to make sure I didn't have it, which I don't. So I knew that this was more serious.
And you saw the family dynamic changing as far as your parents shifting care or shifting attention, or you feeling left out or anything like that?
Gradually, over time, they had started going to taking my brother to more surgeries over the years as he had more tumors that they needed to remove. And so I guess it was a gradual process, but it was a tough situation where I did have to take a back seat, and the focus was on him, on my brother, and obviously recovering from surgery because there's no such thing as a simple surgery. So definitely something to be taken seriously. And it was hard at times because I definitely was feeling, I had my own emotions, but they really needed to focus on him, on my brother. And so it was definitely challenging.
Understandably so, but it also sounds like it came during your teen years, maybe college years, and that is a serious stage of life because you really need the input or the steadiness of your parents. So, did you ever have any particular feelings about that? Were you able to make educated understandings about your brother's condition as you got older, or were they kind of still leaving you out because they were so focused on taking care of him?
Over time, they did kind of share more about it. And then I did learn, it was in my college years when I did learn that his case was more severe. And that was at the point when my brother did lose his ability to speak, and he became fully deaf at that point. And so I was secondhand witnessing the effects of this disorder. And that was when my parents transitioned into full-time caregivers for him. Because at that time, we weren't sure how long he was going to be with us.
Hmm. How did that affect you? Or are you still focused on your life and trying to keep your head above water?
I think I always kind of knew that my brother wasn't going to be with us for the long term. For me, it wasn't a shock so much, but I think it was something where I tried not to think too much about it because it would come about or bring about feelings of sadness and grief. And so at that time, I was in college and focusing on my career path. And I think I looked for distractions during that time.
Did you have any personal relationship with God at this time?
Yes, my family and I, we were all very close. I had a very close relationship with God and always, my parents always emphasized attending church and having that Christian community. So we always had that faith growing up.
Did you have any why questions for God as you were watching your brother?
I think I definitely wondered why my brother was allowed to go through the suffering that he did. That was a question I had. And sometimes I still wonder, but I know God's will is something we'll never fully understand. So that's where faith comes in. And I've definitely had to remind myself of that.
I know when life gets turned upside down, or certainly when it's impacted in a way that it changes either the dynamic, the direction, the shape of the family, the natural flow of the family, there becomes an identity issue. Things that you lose that you had part of your identity with. Did you ever experience any sort of identity issue as a sister, as a daughter, as this is unfolding?
I think sometimes I did feel like my identity as the daughter of the family kind of got undermined, or I guess that I was the secondary focus. That the primary focus was my brother, and then secondary is like, oh, they have a daughter too. But I don't blame my parents for that. I know that in that situation they really did need to focus on hit my brother's health, but sometimes it was it, there with some of the people that they encountered, they would ask like, oh, do you have any other children? And then it's like, oh yeah, they have a daughter too.
I think about what it takes under those conditions. Like, it doesn't seem like your parents had any other option. But even with that in mind, there's still pain that surrounds that change where they are focusing on your brother. And I wonder, did you have any sort of encouragement for someone who would be in your shoes as a 9 to 16-year-old who is going through this? Any sort of encouragement, or maybe even any advice for the parents who are trying to balance both ends of that spectrum?
I think a lot of it is just being able to forgive ourselves, give ourselves the grace that we give other people. Because especially when you're in a traumatic situation like that, we're not going to be perfect. We're going to make mistakes. We can't always give our full attention to, like if you have multiple kids, give your full attention to all the kids. Like there might be a situation where one of the children might feel left out. And I think parents should be able to give themselves that grace and forgiveness. Like it's okay. Like you're going through a tough time, even if, maybe that day they weren't giving themselves as much or giving a child as much attention as they'd like, they can definitely make up for it the next day. That basically every day is a new beginning. So it's kind of like metaphorically, you can like rip out a piece of paper from a notepad and start new. And that's kind of how I try to view each new day. It's a new chance to start over, basically.
I love startovers, do overs. And we do serve the God of do overs. He's so patient and he's so kind. That's good advice because I think we do need to give each other grace. And especially, I like the point you made, the grace that we give others. We're quick to give others grace, but kind of hard on ourselves when we think we're failing. But the truth is I don't think you can succeed in every single area of your life at the same time, all the time. I think there is a flow to that. When you're focusing on one, the others might be suffering in some degree, some way, not maybe not necessarily bad. But then I also think about children. You were saying, you can do a start over, a do over every day. And kids will respond to even the smallest gesture and find it very encouraging and joy filled that they were able to spend a few minutes, get a sweet message from their parents. So it goes a long way with kids, I think.
Yeah, definitely. I try to do that with my own kids too. Having a baby and a toddler, sometimes I don't give my toddler as much attention as I'd like because I'm with the baby. And so I try to be better the next day if I wasn't playing with him as much the previous day.
Yeah, that's definitely a hard balancing act. I watch my sons and daughters-in-law with their children, and it's quite the balancing act. When did you lose your brother?
So I lost him. He was almost 30, so 29 when he passed. And so that was over 5 years ago. And that was the point when I guess his condition, if there wasn't very much else they could do with surgeries or any other treatments.
Had he lost his ability to speak at that point?
It was a few years before that. He had to have a procedure that removed his vocal cords because of tumors that had grown in that region.
That would be pretty hard, I think, not being able to speak or talk or communicate. Did he find another way to communicate?
A text message. He was glued to his phone. That was kind of the way he would talk with people, whether they were in person or not in this, yeah, obviously remote. He would use his phone.
Okay, well, that's encouraging. I like to think about that, as far as still being able to connect with people. When you think about the scope of going through your brother's progressive decline and watching him take it maybe with grace, maybe not, maybe sometimes yes, sometimes no, a real roller coaster ride, I would imagine. What would you say has been your biggest takeaway when it comes to the character of God? Did he show you anything about himself? Because I know that when we're going through something, God has something in it for us. So can you think about something that God's character kind of surprised you to see it true or manifest or
I think definitely after my brother passing, that was kind of the point when I saw how God had worked through his life, my brother's life, to bless other people, even though it was a very challenging time for us and definitely for my brother. My brother did have a lot of connection with a lot of friends, family, and even people he had never met in person that he had met online because he liked to frequent online, I guess, forums, especially with related to video games, because that was one of his favorite pastimes. He had an extensive group of friends and he didn't shy away from talking about his faith. And that was something we learned about after he passed, that he would talk about his Christian faith. He wasn't afraid to like rock the boat or offend anyone if they had different opinions. And I learned that afterward that yeah, he would even have some of those deeper conversations with people that he actually physically never met in person.
so he had he made an impact in such a short, because 30 years is short to me. That's way too short, but so he had an impact. Do you think that had anything to do with his personality, which I guess, you can be bold. You can have a personality that's bold, or do you think he was just connected with a bunch of compassionate people?
He definitely was very outgoing. He wasn't afraid to, yeah, to reach out to people. Yeah, had that very positive, yeah, positive aura around him. So definitely attracted people to him and very hilarious. So I think that was a great way that he could reach out to other people and yeah,
So
and
he
bring them
had,
in the community.
yeah. So he had charm. He was charming.
Yeah.
Well, good. Did you have any particular scriptures that you held on to that at that time? Anything that like helped to encourage you, whether it was because of you were feeling lonely or overlooked, or because you needed to understand death a little better? Anything?
One of the verses that I still hold on to even before and still now is the verse from Philippians about do not be anxious about anything, but in prayer and petition with thanksgiving, present your request to God. That verse definitely is something I held on to because anxiety is very easy. It's very tempting to go into anxiety mode. So I've always had to remind myself of that verse when I start to go into that direction because definitely, well, even now with having kids of my own, very easy to, yeah, very easy to fall into the anxiety mode. So that is something I've always had to hold on to when things are kind of uncertain or challenging.
That lifeline, because it does help break the overwhelm when it starts just running. Like for me, I don't know, I catch myself in the middle of, I've gone down this long road of worrying about something, and I'm like, just stop for a minute, Sherry. Just focus back on God, recenter yourself, because I think it does make a difference in what you focus on.
Oh, yes, definitely.
You focus on the Lord, you're encouraged. You focus on the problem. Somebody said the other day, I think it was Chris Valatin. I'm not pronouncing his last name right. And he said that fear is worshiping the wrong God. And I thought that was pretty interesting. I was like, that is so true, but I never really thought about it like that. I know God changes things, but simultaneously, he transforms us in the process. Can you think of a way that God transformed you going through your brother's diagnosis, the decline, and then his death? Maybe you had a fresh perspective, or maybe on death, maybe, or and did he take you into a deeper level of intimacy? What? How did he transform you?
I think definitely after my brother had passed, that kind of made me kind of begin to wonder about the next steps in my life and me and my husband, where we were going to go next. Because for so long, almost our identity was kind of wrapped in our hometown, which at that time was San Diego. We both grew up in that area. We had a lot of our memories in that area, and that was when we began to wonder if like maybe God was leading us out of San Diego, moving to another part of the country and starting a new line of work. And that is actually what happened. That it was just like about 4 years ago when I visited the North Idaho area by Coeur d'Alene. That that area. And I happened to stumble upon a house that fit exactly what my husband and I were looking for. Because at that time we were only in a 1-bedroom apartment trying to save up for a house that we couldn't afford in Southern California. So in Idaho, we actually found a house that was exactly what we were looking for. And so then, yeah, shortly after, a few months after that, we moved up to Idaho, not really knowing anyone and starting a new journey up here. And then a year later, that was when we welcomed our baby boy into our family. And that's also when I stepped down from, at that time, I was an accountant, a full-time accountant. And so I stepped down from that position to take care of my son.
And I'm sure that's been very rewarding.
Yeah, it's been definitely a process, but very positive process. But it was definitely a lot of change in such a short period of time.
Does it ever enter your mind? And if so, how do you rely on God if this were to happen to your son? And I don't know if that's genetic. I don't know if that's something that can happen, but 1 in 40,000, I
Yeah.
don't think that's possible. But did things like that? Because I've talked to other people who have things in their family. I'm trying to think of conditions in their family that they haven't seen come to fruition, but they were concerned about it. They did have to talk to God about those things.
In the case of my brother, it was a mutation, so it wasn't passed down or it's not in the family. But that is something where I have wondered, and because I experienced that having a brother who had a serious condition, that I had wondered what would I have done, and I have to instead just choose to trust God that whatever would happen, that He would be there to help me through the challenges, and right now, not to worry about that because something like that happening is very rare. So there's really no point to worrying. But it is something where yeah, I just have to take each day at a time and be appreciative of the people in my life and the blessings that we have each day and not worrying about the future.
And that's wisdom too, to take each day at a time and to trust that God, because that was probably my biggest takeaway after I lost my husband. Because I was asking the Lord, Lord, you didn't show up when I needed you to show up. And now everything feels like it's at risk. Everything, anything could go. And he, impressed upon my heart, he's spoken to my spirit. I don't hear audible words about, I don't care what happens around you in the sense that I'm writing a much bigger love story with you as the individual I created you to be. You keep your eyes on me. I will always be there. I'm never leaving. And so I will walk you through whatever happens. So he calmed my fears by telling me he would be present through all of it. Whatever this life brought, whatever I would experience, he was going to be the root and the purpose and the reason why I would, move through it. So that was comforting to me to think, you know what? I think that's the core of everything. We don't want to be alone. I don't want to be alone, especially when you're going through pain and suffering. And so I think that it's calmed me immensely and it gives me great comfort and encouragement to this day. I'm not saying I'd be happy if something bad happened or something, you know, impacted my life in such a negative way, but I know I'm not alone and that's very comforting for for the journey.
That's what I've reminded myself too.
Yeah. And that scripture you picked out too, that's helpful in that way. Mm. How did you find a way to hold on to God's plan for your life when life really isn't making much sense? Maybe you hold on to a promise God has for you, but how do you stay anchored when things get what feels like overwhelming or out of hand? How do you refocus?
What helps me is definitely being able to take a step back and look at the past and look at how God has worked in my life previously and seeing how far I've come from that point. And so just in the past 5 years, there has been tremendous growth that my husband and I have gone through with the buying of the house, moving up to moving up to Idaho, having a son and now our daughter. So having 2 kids. And then now just having finished my first book being published, just all of that of all those changes within just a short period of time. It's just been kind of evidence that God is working in our lives, even when we don't, we begin to wonder, like, oh, are you doing something with this? Because there was a waiting period for us after it was just after my brother passed. And then that was when the COVID pandemic began. And so we were feeling more isolated from other people because we were working remotely at home, not really seeing anyone and living in the apartment. And that was a point where I had to just kind of pray to God and trust him that he was doing something with this waiting period, even though it didn't feel like it. But then now I can look back at that time and say, yes, he was doing something. It just involved us kind of having to be patient in the waiting.
Ah, the waiting. That's tough sometimes, is the waiting. And I want to get to you being an author, but when you're moving from a place where you guys were both born, raised, connected, family, friends, church, and you're starting to feel isolated as far as COVID goes, but then you move to a place where you could really be isolated as far as you didn't know anybody there. There were no connections there. How are you doing now? How's the family doing now in this area,
So
location that you live in?
So we've definitely made more connections since moving up here. It helps having kids. We can find other families with small children we can have play dates with for our kids. And so that's kind of the new chapter that we've gone through with having more like family friends, kind of like the family friends I grew up with from my parents when they made friends. And so we're hoping to do the same thing, find close family friends where our kids can be friends too.
Yeah, that does make a difference when you can get connected up with for your kids and whatnot. How did your parents feel about you leaving?
So my parents actually moved up as well to this area. They were also looking for a change, and since I don't have any other siblings, they wanted to be close with me, and so we kind of
Yeah.
moved up around the same time, which was a blessing. I'm very glad that I have family up here, and they wanted to be near their grandkids, obviously. So
Yes.
that
I
was
can, yeah, I can speak to that. You want to be near your grandkids. As a matter of fact, my son and daughter-in-law can show up, and I would, if they don't have the baby, I'm like, what are you here for? Like, what do you need? And I'm like, where are the babies? Bring the babies. How are you guys doing with going from sunshine and 80 degrees with the beach, the ocean, to the mountains? Although I will say a mountain view is absolutely gorgeous. And then, but you've got snow, colder weather.
I actually don't mind the cold. I don't like excessive heat, so I appreciate the seasons. And then it also gives you an opportunity to kind of look forward to the different changes of the seasons. If you don't like one season, just wait a few months and then there'll be another, new season. So I actually like it.
Good. That is nice too to get all four seasons. As far as a writer goes, you get them cold, wintry seasons, and it gives you a reason to be inside the house on the sofa a little bit longer and not out in the yard.
Yeah, if my kids let me, my toddler definitely wants to go outside.
So you don't get much of a break there.
Honey naps when they
Okay.
hopefully both nap. That's the goal.
Well, that is impressive that you wrote a book and you have two little children because that's time consuming. Their level of need is very high at that age. And I believe that a writer's biggest challenge is to put their butt in a seat and actually get the words on paper. So that's pretty incredible that you were able to do that. When I think about you being in the corporate world as an accountant and then you change over to being a stay-at-home mom and writing a book, what did God use about your time as an accountant and then translate that over into being an author or even a mom?
So I definitely think during that period when I was in full-time accounting, it was kind of I definitely was a profession where it's useful even after leaving the workforce. I could still use it for our personal finances, which is always a good skill to have. But it definitely was a waiting period where I knew the long term I didn't want to stick around with it. But it did give me some time just to kind of think about what I was hoping for in the future. And it definitely was a waiting period. But it was a very stable source of income and something I can teach our kids when they get older and they need to like buy a house or just live on their own, basically.
Yeah. Important life skills for sure. I always like asking that question, especially when there's a drastic change such as yours, because corporate can be very regimented and demanding. And then you get what I would call freestyle of being at home. However, it could also be your worst enemy if you don't have the ability to discipline yourself and to, plan the way, how to get things done, schedules, and still be flexible because you know yourself with littles, you don't get a lot done in one day that is separate from their level of need or their food and laundry and toys and stuff like that, naps and whatnot. So it's interesting to see how God uses what we've been through because he never wastes anything. And then he builds on that into the next stage, next chapter of your life. So that's interesting always for me to hear people explain God, yeah, God used that, launched me into this, and I can still use that and whatnot. So that's always interesting to me. Back to you being an author or more specific questions in reference to that. What do you think it is about writing that's so powerful when it comes to processing grief?
I think for me, it was an opportunity to kind of look back on the positive memories I had with my brother, and I was able to appreciate the times I did have with him and kind of incorporated that into a story. Even though the story that I wrote was fiction, I did use some of my personal experiences with loss, being able to properly grieve the loss of my brother, but at the same time being able to appreciate the memories that we had together and being able to back at the legacy that he left behind. And so in part, this book was a way to pay homage to him, to my brother. And that I'm hoping that this book also can resonate with other people who have lost someone dear to them.
And your books are family friendly, which I think is very good because you can't read a book today, especially, and I don't know what age group your books are for, but when you get young adult YA, they no one spares those children anything.
Technically, this book is actually for young adult, like 18 to 25-year-olds. So
Okay.
I would say past adolescence because there's some more mature subject matter, but it is
Okay.
still very, I would say heartwarming, still not cynical, because I do think there's a lot of cynicism that happens, especially when you get to adulthood or nihilism. And definitely wanted to go away from that. Yeah, go in the other direction of that there's hope and kind of having themes of hope in this book.
That's good because again, they people think it's so important to go into these topics of suicide, self-harm. They think talking about how to do that, and gender identities and gender issues, it's refreshing to think that there's a book that you can actually read that takes the weight of that world off of you and gives you encouragement and hope for a better tomorrow. So, yeah, I'm going to have to look into your books because it sounds like they'd be a great read. Just to take a break from life in general and enjoy encouragement. The book you wrote, Among the Stars, how much of that is a reflection of your life? I know you said that you used it to write the story, but how much of it is a reflection of your life? And the main character, Natalie Baker, how much of her is you?
So Natalie, I can definitely see that there are some parallels with her personality and mine. We can both be perfectionists for one. So that's something I've experienced having to kind of take a step back if I get too much into perfectionist mode like her. Also, the process of losing a family member because she loses her father. I lost my brother. So those are parallels that we've had. But also a theme or that I touch on in the book is about your identity, keeping your identity separate from your career because when I was an accountant, I did have to make sure that I didn't identify myself as, oh, you're a CPA, that I had to be able to distinguish the two, my personal identity and my career. And similarly, Natalie also has to do that with her journey because she is a resident doctor and that is obviously a very time consuming career. And so she's had to also kind of find that distinction and also in the book, a childhood friend that she has in the book, Justin, has an even harder time with that distinction because he, as it turns out, is a movie star. And I cannot imagine having that process of having to separate the identity that everyone sees you as and then like with your career and then yourself, like your own personal identity, like being famous. I can't even begin to imagine that challenge.
Yeah, because there are even some comedians where you look at them and you wonder, are they always on, and I air quoted on? Do they always feel like they have to be the comedian, or can they actually relax in their life and be not the comedian, whoever they are, apart from that? But that's a good point too, because identity is everything. I think the more I hear about what people are struggling with and depression and anxiety and gender and whatnot, it seems to be that it's identity based. I think that's the core. So I think one of the things that would be important, and it's what I tried to do with my boys because they pursued motocross, and my oldest did go professional. My youngest wasn't as interested in it as the older one. And so eventually he went professional. But one of the distinctions I tried to make for them is that motocross is something we do, that is not who we are. Because I knew that at some point we would be separated from it because athletes have a very short window to actually hit their peak and to maintain that. And so I wanted them to know that they had more going on in life than just motocross. Like I would tell them that all the skills you're learning on the track are the same skills that you can apply to life, overcome the situation, fight to maintain your position in situations where it's important that you maintain that. If you fall down, get up, read the track, read people, read life, but ultimately you're in God's hands through all of that. So identity is huge. What sort of encouragement would you have for somebody about identity?
I definitely think for identity, for I guess my personal journey has been kind of praying about it, turning to God, kind of seeing that my identity first and foremost should be in Him, with my relationship with Him, and then everything else kind of follows in line after that. That's my primary focus. Even my identity as a mother or a wife, that comes secondary. And that's something I've had to remind myself even now, because there is that temptation there to want to identify yourself based off of like what you're doing. Even right now, even though I don't earn any income, it's like, oh, very tempting to be like, oh yeah, I'm a mother because I have these two kids. But there's more than just mother. And so identity comes from God. That's what I've had to remind myself.
And I agree too, because even with my role as wife, and I think it's normal, it's natural that you invest yourself in that role, you invest yourself in that title, if you will. But that was probably one of my biggest struggles was when my husband passed away. So the wife title is just ripped off me. And I was like, well, who am I now? I don't really, how do I separate myself from that? Do I separate myself? I have to separate myself from that because I'm not a wife anymore. And then, of course, then you get labeled widow. And I'm like, what is a widow? How do you be a widow? Except that it was just given to me and I didn't ask for it. So identity again is really huge in your books. If you're writing, storylines about identity, or at least giving examples of strong identity in women, men, whomever you're writing about. I think that's a good value as well to your stories. This is one of the reasons why I love writing, and I don't do any creative writing anymore because I'm focused on my blog and my podcast, writing copy for that and for social media posts. So that's the type of writing I do now. But what you've done with your book, you've expressed yourself on paper, which I personally equate that to being a beautiful purge session. And what I mean by purge is that sometimes there's just way too much overload in your mind. And so you pour it out onto paper. So you haven't lost your thoughts because they're captured on paper. You simply take the weight of them off of your mind. And to me, that's cathartic in itself. But you also create one of the strongest bonds that humans can have, and that is through storytelling, specifically a vulnerable confession. That really brings people together. What's been your most rewarding or personally rewarding accomplishment of writing a book? And it could be from an author's perspective or from you as the one who walked through that grief.
Definitely. So with finishing this book, just being able to say that I've completed a story, that is a first for me. I've never actually finished a book. Growing up, I liked to write for fun. Even when I was very little, I would often staple pieces of paper together and make like little stories with
Oh,
pictures. But I never actually finished a story with that had like a plot, like yeah, with plot and character development. When I got to be, I guess, teenager and I wrote books, I would usually stop at like the 25% mark of the story and never actually finished it. But it wasn't until this book, when I actually like I found the inspiration to keep going past the 25% mark. And I just allowed myself, like when I had the ideas, I just kept writing them down and kept going. And before I knew it, there was a complete story. And so that in itself, I think, is an accomplishment that I can be thankful for. Because a year and a half ago, if someone had told me that I was going to complete a book and publish it, I wouldn't have believed them. It just wasn't something I could fathom. But now it's just, I'm very, very thankful that God gave me the words to complete a book.
yeah, because I'm telling you, that is a miracle. I believe everyone has a story in them. I believe that we could all share something because that's the connection with people. You and I are sharing a bit of a story, a little bit of your life, a little bit of my life. When you sit with people, you're sharing about their day. What have you been up to? Tell me what you've been doing. How are you doing? And so you engage in storytelling. Really, I don't know that we think about that. We think about it as conversation, but nonetheless, we are sharing with you, each other, something about ourselves, and that's storytelling. So that to me is the core connection of human beings is talking about your life. Let me hear about, his or her life, and it creates bonds. It seems like the strongest bonds or the strongest reaction that I get from people is when I share things about my life that are very painful, and people immediately gravitate to that, whether they share in a type of grief that's similar to mine and they know what it feels like, or whether they're compassionate or just genuinely, want to say a kind word. Either way, or anyway, it does create a bond for people. And I love that. I love that about human beings, that we connect over words. As we're talking, I've decided what the title of your podcast is going to be: Blending Passion and Pain. Because I think that would be what we all would do, maybe. I don't know. When it comes to fulfilling our purpose in life, I don't know.
I definitely believe pain is kind of shaped as a way, or I guess it helps us grow. So it can be a tool. I think that is God uses to kind of help us to grow. Because I can say without some of those hardships, I wouldn't be who I am today. So even though I don't definitely haven't enjoyed the process. When you're in the middle of the pain, looking back, I can be thankful that we've grown. My husband and I have made a lot of change in just the short period of time.
I know that my biggest growth points in life have been in pain. And I know that through my husband's death, that's when I grew into such a deeper intimacy with Christ. I didn't even really know it was missing. Like I had intimacy with Christ. But when he got me through that, I was rather blown away by how deep my intimacy had grown. Are you currently working on another book?
The goal is to write another book actually in the same universe that is actually going to follow one of the characters, Olivia, in that is in the first book, kind of sharing her story and her growth, yeah, that she goes through. And
What's that focus?
that focus is kind of on her family dynamics and her personal relationships because we don't know very much about her. So I'm kind of going to open up about her world and show how and kind of, yeah, her growth journey.
Okay, so push her out, push her life out, and take a look at where she's going and where she's been.
Yeah.
Do you go into like any sort of healing process with your characters?
I definitely kind of show how much, well, kind of their, I guess, what do you call it, character development, and kind of show how they start and where they finish and how they grow throughout that time. There's definitely healing. And this Among the Stars, I can definitely say that for Natalie, that she goes through a lot of growth, and Olivia will be the same way, where at the end they're in a very different place than where they were in the beginning of the story.
I know your books are family friendly. Do you mention God in them? The God of the Holy Bible?
So I definitely allude to God. I do want the story to be accessible to a variety of different audiences, but I don't shy away from the ultimate purpose of our lives being a kind of a part of a greater plan, God's greater plan, which is something I hint at a few times in this book, Among the Stars.
A family friendly read is refreshing. And so it sounds like I would enjoy that. I want to ask you this question. One of the central themes in your book is that everything happens for a reason. Can you tell me your perspective on that?
So that is something where, as I previously mentioned, it's kind of a motif that I have throughout the book that our lives are, we only see one little piece of it. It's like a puzzle piece. We might see one piece of the puzzle, but we can't see the full puzzle. And so that is basically that God, He has a purpose in our lives. Our lives are used for His greater purpose. And that's something that we can't see. We can't see the full picture, but what it does give us is hope that there is always hope to be found even in the darkest of places. And sometimes it does involve us like actively looking out for those silver linings or blessings in our lives, because sometimes it does take effort, because I know that the world, it can be a very negative place if we allow it. And that's when we really just need to kind of lean in on kind of God's greater understanding that we can't, because we can't see it, but our lives are being used for a greater purpose. And so even if we don't like where we're at right now, that it's still being used. There's still hope to be found. And that is something I definitely dive into as a theme in this book.
You remind me of something that I took away after walking with God through my valley, and that is that God always has a plan. Always has a plan. So I've learned to relax more in Him. I'm not saying that I just sit back and let life happen because God's got a plan. I don't do that. I'm engaged with God's heart and what He's doing. But I am confident and can relax in the fact that God always has a plan. It's always going to work out. So, like you're saying, you might not like where you're at in the current moment because you're going through something. But the higher purpose, the greater purpose is something you settle your heart with too. Like, okay, God knows what He's doing. He always has a plan. There must be a higher purpose for this because it's really not making much sense to me at this time. And then you can look back and see that gold thread of how He was working through that situation. Which reminds me, when you look back over the time that you were spent year after year, literally saying goodbye to your brother as he would lose, different levels of abilities, what would you say? How can you see God showing up in that?
Oh, I can definitely see like God. for instance, he put various people in our lives, family and friends, who kind of provided that support and encouragement along the way, even when we were going through some pretty tough times with my brother. One, or I guess a couple of particular instances of that is when our family and friends would kind of gather together, and we participated in a charity event. Basically, it was a 5K race to raise funds for the charity that it's called Children's Tumor Foundation, that raises funds for, or to find a cure for his disorder. And so we had about a few hundred people coming together, dressed up, a lot of them dressed up in my brother's favorite video game costumes, and running this race for him. And it was a very, very encouraging thing to see, just people coming together in solidarity and community. And that is something that I'm very thankful for, like looking back. And we've done that. We participated in that race for several years.
That's the fingerprints of God, relationship building and growing connection. I think that's the heart of God, really. Well, we've run out of time, so let me ask you these two closing questions. And it might be the fact that you even reiterate things that you've already shared. But the first one is, have I not asked you about something that you want to share about right now before we close?
Well, I can say that the book Among the Stars that I've just released, if anyone is interested, it can be found on Kindle or Amazon, and it will be in bookstores as well, for if anyone's interested in purchasing that book.
We will definitely put the links, the Amazon links, in the show notes so that people will have direct access to that. But Among the Stars by Denise Clanin.
Yes.
My last question for you is, if our listeners remember only one thing about your message today, what do you want that one thing to be?
I would definitely say it comes down to hope, right? That there is always hope to be found. I know that right now we are in kind of a very challenging time with mental health. I know that there's been skyrocket in cases of anxiety and depression, and even my family has experienced some of that with mental health. And I would say if you're in the middle of that, where you're feeling like hopeless and that you don't think there's hope to move forward, I would argue that there is always hope to be found. It does involve actively being able to look for those silver linings or blessings in our lives, and turning to prayer also is a great way to kind of to get grounded in God, and knowing that he has a purpose in our lives, just like that metaphorical puzzle that we can only see one piece of it, but there is an ultimate framework of a puzzle being worked in our lives, in all of our lives. And that's just, I guess, want to encourage that there is always hope.
That is a beautiful encouragement, because it really drives home that we build our identity in Christ, and that's who we turn to. That's who our shelter is. That's who our protection is. That's who gets us through things. Because you and I will both admit sometimes God doesn't change our situation, but he will transform us. And that's a beautiful thing, a beautiful exchange, because you find out things about him that you would have never known in any other context. And the things you find out are life-changing.
It's definitely.
Denise, thank you so much for being here. I deeply appreciate your time and your ability to put words onto paper and to craft a beautiful story of hope, encouragement. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for your time and for sharing this experience with my guest. I hope you have found encouragement for today and a deeper revelation of God's heart in the midst of pain and suffering. We'd love to have you as a subscriber to Finding God in Our Pain, so that you can be connected with all my guests as they share their personal experiences and professional knowledge about pain and suffering. And because this podcast is a division of the website A Life of Thrive, for more information and the various ways you can connect with us, please visit the website alifeofthrive.com. I look forward to sharing more transparent stories from the hearts of women who intimately know what it means to have their world flipped upside down, their authentic struggle to make sense of it, and what recovery and healing looks like. Till then, sweet woman, remember you are not alone, and that God speaks the most beautiful things in the dark.